Albert Einstein once said, "The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it." Parents have two main jobs: to love their children and to protect their children. When a mom or dad has failed to do those things, there are systems in place that are supposed to intervene and to be an advocate for the vulnerable and the voiceless. We have all heard the saying, if you see something, say something, and we assume that by doing so, children will be protected. But what happens when they're not? Even if you're screaming at the top of your lungs that something is wrong. Hey guys, I'm Elise. This is 10 to Life, and let's get right into it. The cases we discuss that involve children are always some of the most difficult to cover. There is something so much more disturbing about crimes against people who are completely innocent and defenseless, and I know that it can evoke a lot of sadness and be triggering for some people. However, when researching this case, I was left not only feeling extremely sad, but really, really angry. When a child dies at the hands of another person, usually we can say, wow, if only someone had known what was going on, or, oh, I wish somebody would have spoken up sooner. But in this case, several people knew what was going on, and several people did speak up, but it ended up not being enough. Anthony Avalos was born on May 4th, 2008 in Palmdale, California. He was born to teenage parents Victor and Heather Barron. Soon after Anthony was born, Victor, a citizen of Mexico, had to return to his home country and was unable to be there in person to see his son grow up. He tried his best to FaceTime Anthony as much as possible, but forming a bond with an infant over the phone proved to be extremely difficult. And over time, these calls became less and less frequent. As a young mother, Heather was growing up right beside Anthony and was trying to find her place in the world. Over the years, she had multiple boyfriends, and she also became pregnant by almost every single one of them in her 20s, ultimately giving birth to 7 children. Now, one child is hard enough to raise on your own as a young parent, so you can imagine how stressful and financially difficult this became for Heather. She was only making a very small amount of money working at a sandwich shop, and she was also receiving government welfare to be able to care for herself and for her children. People who knew Heather also described her as impatient, on edge, and even volatile, which she blamed on the stress of being a single parent. Now, I'm going to just kind of talk out of pocket for a second here and share my opinion on this, and it's probably because I already know where this case is going. I understand being stressed as a single parent. 100%. I understand, the weight that you would carry for financial burdens and just the anxiety in it all. Then maybe stop having sex and getting pregnant by every boyfriend of yours in your 20s, or use protection, or do something. Because if you willingly are, admitting that you become volatile because of the stress from being a parent to so many kids and you're so young, stop having kids. Make the guy glove up. Take birth control, or don't have sex. Do something. The answer is not keep pumping babies out. And so I'm sorry, I know I'm probably going to get mixed opinions on that, but come on, that is not an excuse here. And what's even worse is it seemed like Heather blamed her children for all of the problems in her life, but yet she just continued getting pregnant with each new boyfriend that she got into a relationship with. She would just get pregnant right again. Now, part of me thinks that she probably hoped that one of these men would step in to the role of a consistent father figure and maybe help share the burden of raising and providing for her children. But when that didn't happen, it seemed like she resented her kids rather than herself for the choices that she made, which got her into that situation. While Heather worked at her minimum wage job, she was unable to afford daycare and relied on various family members to watch the kids. By 2012, Anthony was often babysat by his grandpa, Heather's father, which ended up being one of the very first documented situations of physical harm that would happen in Anthony's life. At only 4 years old, a family member reported that Heather's father began Anthony at just 4 years old, and DCFS became involved in the family's life at that point for the very first time. During the investigation, there were obvious signs that this had in fact taken place against Anthony in his grandfather's home. However, instead of reporting the evidence to the police, DCFS caseworkers told Heather to keep Anthony away from her father and told her that she needed to get Anthony in counseling for what had taken place. Heather assured the caseworkers that she would get counseling for Anthony, but no charges were ever brought towards his grandfather, and the case was then closed. Even worse, Heather did not keep her word and never enrolled Anthony in any sort of counseling or therapy, and some reports even allege that she still allowed her father to babysit Anthony from time to time. Unbelievable. Once the case was closed, no caseworkers checked in on the family or on Anthony to see how he was coping, which, as you can imagine, turned out to be not well at all. Like so many other children who have experienced that type of harm, Anthony got in trouble at school a lot. He got in trouble mainly for acting inappropriately toward other students on the playground, clearly due to, in my opinion, unresolved trauma and confusion about what was done to him at the hands of someone who he trusted. After the first encounter with the DCFS, over the years there would be several more cases opened about Anthony and his siblings. DCFS would get to know the family very, very well and actually became a consistent fixture in their lives. In 2014, one of Anthony's aunts, named Crystal, opened up to her therapist about how she worried about the safety of her nieces and nephews because she claimed to have seen Heather hit the children, withhold food, and lock them up for hours as forms of punishment. The therapist, being a mandated reporter, called DCFS to report these allegations, and a lead case manager named Mark Millman opened a new investigation regarding the conditions in Heather's home. Several caseworkers were sent to the home to investigate these allegations, and at now 6 years old, Anthony, being the oldest child, was able to verbally express some of the things that were taking place. Anthony explained to the caseworkers in detail severe punishments that they would receive at the hands of Heather. During this time, DCFS was also made aware of more inappropriate behavior that Anthony was displaying, because he was again never able to undergo therapy that had taken place 2 years prior. The caseworkers assigned by Mark Millman to conduct the investigation made note that they believed that the children were being neglected in the home, and that they were malnourished and in poor sanitary conditions. Heather admitted to the workers that she was extremely overwhelmed, having 4 children at the time and 1 on the way, but she was willing to accept assistance voluntarily to better her family situation and her parenting skills. DCFS made the decision at this time to keep the case open, but instead of separating the children from Heather, they offered her assistance through a voluntary family maintenance program. This program was designed for low-risk families who just needed a little help and not any major interventions. Now, this was another decision heavily criticized because when Heather was given the chance to voluntarily enroll Anthony in counseling in the past, she failed to do so. And how this now situation that has escalated and continued for years is deemed low risk, I have no idea. And one thing to note is that this particular jurisdiction of DCFS utilized something called risk assessment software. Caseworkers, counselors, and management would enter in data about a particular family, and then based on that data, the software would objectively analyze the results and then provide a level of risk, along with suggested interventions based on that risk level. For example, severe malnourishment or maternal bonds, maybe perhaps drug usage, it would all categorize that situation as high risk and might give intervention options like emergency foster care, mandatory parenting class, therapy for the children, things like that. This type of software theoretically takes the guesswork and possible emotional bias out of the decision-making process, and it helps the caseworker come to a conclusion based on all of that information. This again would theoretically be great and possibly a life-saving tool when used correctly. But as we will see, the system can be overridden, and many caseworkers at this particular DCFS office blatantly ignored the risk assessment and the suggestions that came with it, possibly due to high-risk interventions requiring a lot more time and work than a low-risk situation. While Anthony and his siblings were clearly in a high-risk situation, Mark Millman gave the go-ahead to override the suggestions and allow Heather to participate voluntarily in low-risk programs, rather than mandating more involved programs which would have greatly benefited her and the children. The voluntary family maintenance program that they began visiting was not used to help families that had as severe of issues as Heather and her children. One of the counselors involved in this initial program reported that Heather had seemed very impatient with her kids, that she lacked necessary parenting skills, and seemed hateful and volatile towards her children, even in front of the professionals at the facility. The counselor also wrote that she believed Heather to lack awareness of her own mental health issues, and believed that she did not have the capacity to properly care for her children. Like before, Heather started taking her children to this facility less and less, and did not utilize any of the free services such as individual and group therapy, mentorship programs, or classes that could have helped her gain some skills to become a better parent. When Heather was questioned about refusing some of these services, she agreed with Mark Millman to begin in-home counseling, with a focus in building familial bonds, which would be conducted by an organization called the Children's Center of Antelope Valley. When counselors from Antelope Valley began coming to Heather's home, they almost immediately noticed very alarming behaviors and more signs of neglect and possible physical harm that was taking place. The counselors reported that they viewed Heather's children, cursing at them, calling them names, all shamelessly, in front of the professionals. When they talked about their concerns with Heather, she admitted that the way she was acting was wrong, but that she was trying her best to work on it. However, the counselors felt as though Heather wasn't working hard enough on improving her behavior, and they feared for the safety and the emotional well-being of the children. Some of them even felt afraid themselves to be in Heather's home because of her emotional outbursts and her volatile demeanor towards seemingly everybody. When they tried to report this information to good old Mark Millman with DCFS, they were usually unable to get in contact with him, and when they did, he had a habit of brushing them off or minimizing their concerns. One of the counselors has said that she felt like their reports weren't being taken seriously, and that she actually decided to call an emergency hotline to try and get action taken for the children. When Heather would bring her children into the Antelope Valley Center for progress monitoring, some of the visits were so alarming to professionals due to her behavior in front of them that several more of them made their own calls to that emergency hotline as well. There are even reports of Heather dragging her kids by the arms around the facility and saying, "Don't think I won't beat your just because they are here." I mean, the absolute audacity. Clearly, you don't think there are going to be any repercussions or any accountability held for your behavior and your actions against your children if you are blatantly inflicting this on your children in front of professionals and saying things like that in front of them. You must have a lot of nerve and a lot of confidence that nothing will happen. And that is very scary, that she was given, literally on a silver platter, the confidence to be like, hey, do whatever you want to your kids because we're not going to do anything about it. We're not going to hold you accountable. So have at it. Have a heyday. Go to Disneyland with it. It's unreal. When the counselors and the other workers tried to explain to Heather that her behavior was inappropriate, she didn't disagree with their claims, but again, she blamed her actions on her children, and reportedly never had a kind word to say about any of her kids. She even admitted to the times when she would put hands on her children because of their bad behavior. Now, to the employees, it didn't even seem like Heather liked her children, let alone loved them. It almost seems like Heather's actions were some kind of drastic cry for help, and like she wanted to get her children taken away due to the stress of being a single parent. But in actuality, she made comments to family members about being worried for that to happen because then she might lose her welfare check. Only cares about the money. Heather's behavior only escalated, with her attitude and treatment of the children worsening significantly after the birth of her 5th child. During this time, out of desperation, one of the counselors from the Antelope Valley called Mark Millman again until she finally got a response, and she voiced her concerns on behalf of everybody at the center. Now, his only response was that he was aware of the situation and he believed that Heather was trying her best. And, get this, not to worry too much about it. That is a direct quote. The employees at the center were so appalled by Mark's response that they decided to call the emergency hotline yet again to not only report Heather, but also DCFS for brushing off their concerns. However, this emergency hotline is run by the DCFS office, and it was soon after this call that Mark Millman then decided to take Antelope Valley off the case and switch Heather's services to a different facility, a third-party contractor called Hathaway Sycamore Child and Family Services. So let's just pause really quick to unload that. He gets a call from these workers saying, we're very concerned, we're witnessing very alarming behaviors, we're hearing very alarming things that she's admitting herself, this is a problem. To which he says, don't worry, don't think too much about it, she's trying her best, it's under control. They're like, this guy is clearly not doing his job, so let's call this emergency hotline and let's report him as well, because we need to get these kids out of this woman's possession. Like, this is not okay. And so they call the emergency hotline, but it happens to be run by the same agency that this guy works for. So then when he catches wind of them reporting him and the case to this hotline, he says, oh, you know what now? We're not even going to work with your company anymore. You're off the case. I'm going to put her with somebody new. At Hathaway Sycamores, Heather's family was assigned a counselor by the name of Barbara Dixon. At this new center, the family practically had a fresh start with people who weren't familiar or aware of Heather's attitude and treatment toward the children. And Heather capitalized on this, because Heather painted a picture that Anthony, being the oldest son, was the problem child, the one in need of the most services. So he became Barbara's primary focus. Now Barbara, a supposed children's counselor, wrote that Anthony was whiny and made trivial and arbitrary goals for him like listen to his mom and do his homework, not taking into account that this child had unresolved trauma of his own grandfather and was also suffering physical harm and emotional harm from his mother, Heather. Instead of making goals that could aid in his healing, she told him to do his homework. Soon after, Mark Millman decided to close the DCFS case, stating that Heather was compliant with services and receptive to outside resources, and that the agency set her up with continued counseling through Hathaway Sycamores. Now, it was during this time, in 2015, that Heather would meet someone that would take this situation from bad to worse. Heather's brother, David Barron, introduced her to a coworker from his job named Kareem Leva. Even though David didn't know much about Kareem, at first he seemed like a nice guy. But he would soon realize that he made a big mistake introducing Kareem into his sister's life. Only a few months into dating, one of Heather's exes noticed marks on he and Heather's 2-year-old son during one of his custodial visits. The boy also had marks and an opened wound behind his ear, and he showed his father that Kareem had yanked on it. Heather's ex reported to the police that Kareem was physically harming his son. And even though the deputy made a report about viewing the injuries, he didn't follow up on any charges, and he didn't try to find or question Kareem either. DCFS was notified about the injuries as well, but they made no contact with Kareem. Now, if DCFS or the sheriff's office would have pulled reports on Kareem, they would have seen that he had 2 restraining orders out against him from 2 prior relationships with whom he also shared children. It also would have been discovered that Kareem was involved in a very dangerous California group. This situation constituted a new DCFS case being opened, but only for the 2-year-old child and not for Anthony or his other siblings. The assigned caseworker, Anna Ciatino, called that child hotline and stated that she did see marks on the child, but she didn't believe there to be any sort of physical harm taking place and only wanted her call recorded to cover their butts. A direct quote.
Another social worker, Anna Shortino, testified about her brief experience with Anthony as she was more focused on Anthony's brother, Angel. When Anna was assigned to the case as an emergency response social worker, she did not review the previous reports of suspected child abuse, of which there were 5. During a scheduled visitation in 2015, Angel's dad noticed, though Anna called the hotline.
Mom says he fell in the shower, child says he fell in the shower, dad's freaking out.
But testified today she ultimately didn't have enough in medical records, interviews, or other documentation.
What's our allegation, would you say? I know you have to put something. To cover our butt? I know, to cover.
To remove the kids from the home.
She reported that the children told her that the boy had fallen in the shower and that the father's claims were unfounded. However, shockingly, this caseworker did take the DCFS software system's advice, and due to that situation being high risk, she reported the claims to the police for a criminal investigation. Finally, the first thing done right here. Unfortunately, though, the officer who received the report happened to be one that was reprimanded in the past for not following through on child investigations. In his own words, he rubber-stamped any reports made by social workers, and he sent it through as if the situation had already been dealt with. The boy's father felt like he had to take matters now into his own hands after he refused to let his son go back with Heather. And with that, there was an altercation, even though you'd think that Heather would welcome having one less child to deal with. Her brother David intervened and offered to take the children to his house until everything calmed down and was sorted out. The teachers and principals at Lincoln Elementary, where Anthony and his siblings attended, were no strangers to DCFS occasionally questioning the children at school about things that had taken place at home, and for the incidents that Anthony had on the playground with some other students. Now, Anthony had confided in Vice Principal Gia Grew about some of the actions and harm that he and his siblings endured, being locked in a room for days with no food, no water, or access to a bathroom, and a punishment that they would have which was known as the captain's chair, which is basically like a wall sit, where you sit against the wall in a seated position, but you have no seat below you. And he told her that if they fell or cried during the captain's chair, they were hurt even more. She immediately notified the hotline once again. During this time, while Anthony and his siblings were staying with their Uncle David, the children opened up to him and his wife about what was happening in that home, and they shared even more disturbing details. They said that Heather's boyfriend Kareem would hang them upside down by their feet over the stair banister and would even drop them on their head sometimes. They also said that Kareem would spank their faces, and they begged their aunt and uncle not to make them go back and stay with Heather and Kareem. They were terrified. David and his wife were sickened and appalled by what they had heard, so they called that emergency hotline as well to report what was happening. When Heather came to pick up her children, her brother David and his wife blocked her from coming inside of their home, and the police were called during the altercation because they were not going to willingly allow Heather to take these kids. When an officer arrived, he later testified that the children told him about Kareem throwing dirty diapers at them, dragging them by the ears, slamming them into walls, and forcing the siblings to fight each other as a form of punishment, only allowing them to stop when one of them was seriously injured. He also reported that there were photos of Heather self-harming on her wrist and threatening to take her own life. The officer recommended that the children not be returned to Heather and Kareem.
I stuck in and talked with a couple of the kids, and a couple of the kids have told me some things that make me not want to release them right now. I'm not going to release them, and I tend to believe the kids. They seem pretty shooken up when I talk to them about it. Mom, at this point, says she's willing to leave them here with brother. Brother is willing to have them stay here.
Okay.
So that's where I'm at.
Okay, so you're leaving them with the brother for how long?
Yeah, I guess until you guys come out and do that referral that you guys have open right now, that 5-day referral.
It also had become clear that Heather was a victim of domestic disputes at this point as well, and that she clearly needed an intervention for her mental health. When DCFS arrived to investigate Uncle David and the police officer's claims, Anthony reportedly stated, "Heather is my old mom. I am a part of this family now. I will never see Heather again. She locks us in rooms and makes us starve." The DCFS worker then decided to call Barbara Dixon at Hathaway Sycamores to see if she had any documentation or knowledge of what was going on inside Heather's home. She told the worker that no one from the facility had ever even heard of these accusations from the children about any type of neglect or physical harm taking place. Now, ultimately, the children were forced to leave and to return home with Heather. And when DCFS workers then visited Anthony at school, he told her that she was starting to act a lot nicer and not locking the door anymore. A few weeks later, at the end of 2015, during another interview with the caseworker, Anthony and his older sibling said that they had lied about Heather and Kareem, that they never hurt them, that they were great parents, which anyone should have been able to see was a clear sign of coaching and coercion. Regardless, the caseworker wrote in her report that the allegations made by David, the uncle, the vice principal, Gia, and the police officer that interviewed the children was inconclusive, and they closed the investigation, stating that the situation was stabilized. A direct word. Only a month later, Barbara Dixon decided that her services were no longer needed, and the family stopped attending counseling at Hathaway Sycamores. Over the course of Heather and Kareem's relationship, there were several times when she would get fed up with him not for hurting her children, but for hitting her. Their relationship was extremely tumultuous, with Heather putting him out, letting him back in, breaking up, getting back together, like a dysfunctional roller coaster from the depths of down there, you know where. Heather was also afraid of ending her relationship with Kareem for good because she knew that he had this affiliation with this California group that was extremely dangerous, and she feared for her life. However, even if she were afraid of Kareem and his group, it was still her duty as a parent to protect her children. And the fact that she herself had been physically harming them before she even met Kareem. It only escalated when she had a partner in crime, so to speak. In 2016, there would be one last call made to DCFS by a domestic dispute service provider that was working with Heather at the time. She testified that during an appointment with the family, she witnessed some of the children getting food out of the trash can at the DV center, and that they appeared to be extremely hungry and thin. She reported that the children all appeared to have marks, even the infant, and when she asked the older children what happened, they told her that Kareem forced them to fight each other. His own sick, personal fight club fantasy. However, when DCFS came out to question the children about what they had said, they once again recanted their statements and said that they had made it all up. Which, hello, obviously, because if you come to the home where Kareem and Heather are, they are going to be terrified and scared about saying anything, so of course they're going to say they're lying. Like, how is this even a system? It is built for failure. When questioned about Kareem, the older children denied knowing who he was, even though the caseworker knew that Kareem had been living with them on and off for years at this point. Now again, I don't think you have to be a professional or a genius to see that the children were more than likely being threatened to take back what they had said and forced to lie about knowing Kareem. The sheriff's office was given the same report from that domestic service provider, and even though they are legally obligated to conduct their own investigation separate from DCFS, the sheriff who received the report decided not to follow up on the complaint. By the end of 2016, the sheriff's office closed their investigation, and DCFS ended theirs as well, marking the allegations from the DV service provider as unfounded. So as you can see, there were countless reports, cases, investigations, and professionals whose sole job was to prevent what happened next. Heather was angry and felt betrayed by her family for reporting her to DCFS. And whether it was her decision or Kareem's, she completely cut ties with all of her family members and did not allow her children to have any more contact with them whatsoever. David and his wife, as well as other members of Anthony's extended family, lived close by and often saw Heather out with the kids, but the children were forced to put their heads down and ignore them. Heather also decided to switch the children to a new school and didn't provide them with any records about the children's history. Even after all that Anthony and his siblings had been through, his teachers described him as a sweet, thoughtful, and extremely emotionally mature, now 10-year-old boy. At his new school, Anthony developed a very close bond with his 4th grade teacher, Harmony Bell, who was impressed by how intelligent Anthony was, how much he loved learning, and how excited he was to always be at school. Miss Bell was probably unaware that school was the only place that Anthony felt safe and secure, and she probably had no idea how much of an effect her love and kindness really had on him. On the last day of school, Anthony wrote Miss Bell a letter, and this letter said, "Dear Miss Bell, thank you for teaching me everything you could. It was such a blessing to meet you. I just hope that when I go into 6th grade, you can come to New Vista so I can see you still. I hope that you can come to my high school, middle school, and college. That way we'll see each other for school years without a problem because how close we are and how we are best buddies and friends. I just want to stay with you forever, but I can't. I just hope you have a good rest of your life because you already know that I'm going to have a good life. Love, Anthony Avalos, your friend." This letter literally makes me cry every time that I read the words in it, because this letter shows how much he wished he could have stayed in that loving presence of his teacher, and how even though he had a horrible home life and had been through more than any of us could possibly ever even imagine, he still had a positive outlook on life and was hopeful for the future. He had dreams of having a great life, of finishing high school and going to college, and he hoped that Miss Bell would be there to see him succeed. Unfortunately, Miss Bell would not be able to see Anthony's hopes and dreams come to fruition, because when school let out, he was once again trapped at home with Heather and Kareem. And this time there would be no teachers, no counselors, and no family members to report what took place during that summer, until it was too late. Beginning in June 2018, Heather testified that Anthony came to her and confided that he thought he might like boys and girls. There is no way of knowing if he actually said this to her or if she made it up as some sort of excuse, but Heather stated that Kareem overheard this conversation and got extremely angry about the possibility of Anthony being bisexual, because Kareem had beliefs that that was not okay. His siblings later reported that that evening, Kareem decided to punish Anthony for what he had said by severely physically harming him and picking him up by the ankles and repeatedly dropping him on his head. According to the siblings and Heather, this punishment, as well as many other forms of physical torment, took place over the course of 5 days before Anthony's little body had enough. On June 19th, Anthony woke up and was covered in injuries from the torment he had endured, and he was actually having difficulty staying conscious. He told Heather that he felt weird, and she testified that she was going to take him to the hospital, but that he asked if he could just go back to sleep. So she decided to let him rest. Later, when she went to check on Anthony, he wouldn't wake up. This annoyed Kareem, who came in the room, picked Anthony up by the armpits, and dropped him on the floor around 10 or so times, before then leaving him in the room to rest some more. His quote. The next morning, Heather went back to Anthony's room, and his little sister later testified that he still didn't wake up and that his body was stiff as a board. She said that Heather got some water and threw it in Anthony's face, but when he didn't wake up, Heather got extremely nervous. She tried to pick him up to take him to the hospital, but was unable to carry him due to his body and how stiff he had become, so she dialed 911.
More than 4 years after 10-year-old Anthony Avalos' death, today, the long last step to find justice begins. Anthony's mother, Heather Barron, and Heather's then-boyfriend, Kareem Leyva, face murder charges related to Anthony and 2 other siblings. The day before Anthony died on June 20th, 2018, Heather called 911 from their Lancaster home.
911, what's your emergency?
My son's not breathing.
What's that?
My son's not breathing.
Prosecutors allege he endured 2 weeks of extreme leading up to what they called the final blows 2 days before the 911 call, accusing Kareem of pinning Anthony by his neck and letting him fall, suggesting that is when he became unconscious. Anthony's autopsy found he died with head trauma and had several other injuries on his body. Both sides will argue whether or not he was malnourished, whether the couple deprived Anthony and his siblings of water, and whether there were inconsistencies between what was reported and when. The trial is scheduled to last 5 weeks.
When Anthony got to the hospital, the doctors who first laid eyes on him reportedly said, "How does this happen?" Over and over, Heather told them that he had suffered from a fall.
Everybody's telling me that I'm a bad mom. This is why the cops are keeping asking me if I'm on drugs. I don't do no drugs. I don't drink. All I do is smoke cigarettes, and that's it. And they keep on looking at me like if I hurt him and I didn't. I swear he was just acting up and he threw himself because he didn't want to eat. He didn't want to eat. That's it.
Anthony's little body was mangled, and they even found cigarette burn marks amongst the extensive markings and bruisings and abrasions. He was immediately put on a ventilator, and the doctors and nurses did all they could to get him in stable condition. Uncle David and his wife showed up at the hospital and had to beg Heather to allow them to see Anthony. And she even had the nerve to make them apologize to her for calling DCFS in the past before she would allow them into his room. The next morning on June 21st, Anthony succumbed to his injuries, and he passed away in the hospital with his aunt and uncle by his side. The children were immediately separated and removed from Heather and Kareem's care, and a children's forensic psychologist was brought in to question them about what had taken place. The children told the psychologist, as well as a grand jury, every detail about the years of the torment that they endured at the hands of Heather and Kareem, and also about the torment to Anthony's death. They explained all of the physical harm that we had all learned about from the previous reports, but they also shared even more information, such as being forced to eat hot sauce, Kareem and Heather pouring hot sauce into Anthony's eyes, forcing them to kneel on raw rice until they had open wounds on their knees for up to 12 hours, and having their faces put into bodily fluids after they had accidents on the floor from being locked in a room for days at a time. They explained how Kareem loved to violently wrestle with them and would put them in chokeholds and slam their bodies onto the floor. Even though all of the children were subjected to this treatment, the 3 oldest children got the worst of it, and Anthony would often accept all of this pain and the inflictions on behalf of his siblings to protect them as best as he could. Based on the children's grand jury testimony, Heather and Kareem were indicted on charges of first-degree murder with infliction of, as well as 2 counts of child harm charges, and they were being held in the LA County Jail. At the beginning of this court case, a new district attorney had just taken office, and he publicly stated that he would not seek the death penalty for any case going forward. So the maximum penalty that Heather and Kareem were facing was life in prison. This angered Anthony's extended family, because even though they knew that Heather and Kareem would most likely never be put to death, being held on death row would be much less comfortable for someone like Kareem, who has plenty of fellow group members in prison and members on the outside who would make sure that he stayed as comfortable as possible while incarcerated. Then, in an uncommon turn of events, the prosecution decided to try Heather and Kareem together, and the prosecutor on the case was actually one who had a lot of experiences in cases just like this. In 2013, the death of Gabriel Fernandez became an extremely high-profile case, and the details surrounding his death and DCFS case handlings are almost identical to Anthony's story. Gabriel Fernandez was killed as a result of years of this torment at the hands of his own mother, and the same case manager who worked and was disciplined for his errors in Gabriel's case was also the one involved in Anthony's case as well. Imagine that. Gabriel also received services from Antelope Valley as well as from Barbara Dixon with Hathaway Sycamores, who was given immunity to testify in the Fernandez trial against DCFS workers. Barbara Dixon testified in his case that she had known about the markings on Gabriel, but knowingly chose to ignore it and not report it as to not make anybody's job more difficult. She was also criticized for copy and pasting generic notes in children's case files, and it was also discovered that she was not even a licensed counselor. But due to her immunity, Barbara was not charged with any wrongdoing, and ultimately she was able to keep her job at Hathaway Sycamores. In fact, no one who mishandled Gabriel's case or Anthony's case were ever fired for the role that they played. How does that happen? In January of this year, the trial began against Heather and Kareem for the death of Anthony. A Superior Court judge was chosen to hear both sides of the case after Heather and Kareem both waived their right to a jury trial. The judge heard all of the evidence about the numerous DCFS reports, the emergency hotline reports, and the testimony from various caseworkers, counselors, and teachers, spanning back to 2014. The prosecutor laid out the graphic details about the years of the torment, and a medical examiner discussed the extensive new and old injuries that were found on Anthony's body. And it was discovered that he had been brain dead in that family apartment for over a day before Heather called 911. In court, the recording was played of Heather in an interview, stating, "I did not hurt my son. I did not let anybody hurt my son. I swear he was just acting up and threw himself on the floor because he didn't want to eat." As if that in any way would explain the magnitude of injuries or what her son had endured. The defense stated that Kareem lacked an intent to kill, and that the children's statements had changed over time, which is not uncommon, we know, for victims of this kind of torment. However, the defense did acknowledge that this case was about severe harm, but that Kareem is not a murderer. Uncle David's wife, Maria, testified that after Anthony and his siblings came to stay with their family, she offered to keep the children, but that Heather said no because she needed to keep her benefits. And she also testified that she wasn't able to see the children ever again until Anthony was admitted into that hospital. During this time, Anthony's extended family filed a lawsuit on his behalf for the multiple social workers that failed to protect him and his siblings, and for failing to properly report all of the actions that they knew about and failed to act on, The lawsuit cited other botched cases such as Gabriel Fernandez and another little boy with strikingly similar circumstances named Noah Cutro. The family received a monumental settlement of $32 million. Heather's lawyer asked the judge to acquit her on the murder and charges because she was just a victim of battered woman syndrome and that Kareem was fully responsible for all of the actions that took place toward Anthony and her siblings. However, in closing arguments, the prosecution reminded the court that Heather, too, did these actions toward her children before she ever even met Kareem, and that she was complicit in Kareem's actions and even participated and instigated some of the physical harm further. On March 7th, 2023, just a few weeks ago, the judge read a 52-page document finding Heather and Kareem guilty of the murder of Anthony and guilty of all of the physical torment and harm toward the other children. Following the verdict, the district attorney released a statement. The statement said, "The brutality that was executed on this young child was unimaginable. No child should endure this kind of violence or at the hands of people who are supposed to love and protect him from harm. The actions taken by the defendants were truly revolting, and I am thankful that they will be held accountable. I am also thankful to the trial team who prosecuted this difficult and traumatic case." Hearing is scheduled for April 25th, 2023. Now, while I agree with the district attorney's statement, he previously said in the media that a sentence of death is never an appropriate resolution in any case. And I don't know about you, but in my opinion, there are definitely some circumstances where the death penalty is appropriate. And this is one of them. Like Anthony's family has stated in the past, Kareem is a prominent member of a very high-profile group and will probably be treated like a king in prison. I hope that when they are sentenced, Heather and Kareem's fellow inmates can recognize them for who they actually are, which are evil, baby killers, and torturers. This photo shows two faces of absolute evil, but I wish I was able to find photos of Mark Millman and Barbara Dixon as well, because they deserve to be called out and known for their part in Anthony's death, as well as Gabriel Fernandez and Noah's. It's common knowledge that DCFS is understaffed and overworked, and that youth counselors all seem to have impossible caseloads. However, the amount of blatant malpractice that these two people, as well as other people involved over the years with this family, it's inexcusable. It's almost like they had to go out of their way to ignore the red flags and the clear signs of neglect that these children were experiencing. And for what? To cut down on some paperwork and home visits? I can't possibly imagine how hard it must be to be a social worker and how much red tape there is and lack of resources. I get that. I know that it takes a special person to do that job and do it well, so I just wish that people who aren't willing to do the job with integrity would just leave it to somebody else. I also understand that burnout is a real issue, but there is no amount of excuses that could make what happened to Anthony and his fellow victims okay. At the very least, these individuals should have been fired, but nobody lost their job for the things that transpired here. I mentioned early in this video that Anthony was forced to become a martyr for change in the DCFS system, because after his death, reforms were finally put into place, as well as more training and staffing. But Anthony should have never had to die for those things to take place. No child should have to die for people to take their jobs seriously. I want to commend all of Anthony's teachers and to the people who worked at Antelope Valley because they really did do their best to try to help him and the siblings. And if DCFS and the sheriff's office would have taken their reports seriously, then Anthony would still probably be here today. This case is just so tragic and revolting, and I hope that Anthony's siblings realize how brave they were for testifying against their tormentors and being little heroes to help get justice for their brother. I hope that they are able to live with loving family members who wanted to care for them all along, and that they get the help that they need so that they can go on and live happy lives in honor of Anthony. As I've mentioned a few times in this video, the case of Gabriel Fernandez and Noah are so eerily similar to Anthony's, so if you would like me to cover those cases as well, please let me know in the comments. I know the majority of you are probably familiar with Gabriel, but some aren't, so let me know in the comments, because it is so important that we shine a light on cases like this so that more systematic failures of the system designed to protect and save children aren't swept under the rug. I know after stories like this, it's easy to lose hope in agencies like DCFS, but in all fields, there are good and bad people. There are social workers and counselors and teachers who would literally lay down their lives to protect children and who get into the field to make a difference. And it's our responsibility to make sure that the bad ones get weeded out and called out if they aren't doing their job. So I urge you, if you see signs like this ever, or you have a feeling that a child might be in danger, make the call. Don't just assume that somebody else will do it or that it's already being taken care of. If you feel like the person you spoke to didn't take you seriously, call again, talk to somebody else. Keep calling and let them know that you aren't going to just let the situation go. In situations like this, children are powerless and oftentimes voiceless. Anthony's story already made an impact on his siblings' lives, and I hope that by sharing what happened to him, other children can be saved by agencies taking these claims more seriously. I know that this was a long and very sad case, but I appreciate you taking the time to listen to Anthony's story. And I hope that we as a society can do better by our children so that nothing like this ever happens again. As we always say, awareness is the biggest unlock and the biggest key to change. So please take a quick moment to take the link to this video, share it in your group chat, on your social media, anywhere, because the more people who are familiar with cases like these falling through the cracks and people turning a blind eye, the more likely they will be and the more encouraged they may be to speak up when they themselves see the signs. It's all about awareness, guys. So please take a moment to share this link where you can, and also let me know below if you want me to cover those other 2 cases, and we will go into those as well. All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in, and until the next one, stay safe.